The candle in the corridor went out just as a hand closed around Eleanor's wrist and pulled her into the dark. She gasped, but before she could speak, a low voice reached her ear, warm and certain, the voice of a man who believed he already knew who stood before him. "You belong to someone else," he whispered, and something in his tone was not anger but grief, as if the words cost him more than she could guess. Eleanor froze. The hand on her wrist was strong, familiar in a way that made her chest tighten, though the darkness hid his face. She knew that voice. She had heard it murmur her name in the quiet hours of a small cottage far from this house, months ago, before either of them had known what waited for them here. "Gideon," she said softly, and the hand on her wrist loosened at once. There was a pause, the kind that stretches too long, filled only with breathing, and the distant sound of a clock somewhere in the great house counting seconds neither of them wanted counted. "Eleanor," he said, and this time his voice cracked in a way she had never heard from him, not even on the night he told her his real name, not even on the morning he left her at the cottage gate with a promise to return. "I thought you were someone else," he said. "I thought you were Vivian." She stepped back from him, though the corridor was narrow and there was nowhere far to go. "Why would you say such a thing to Lady Vivian?" she asked, though her voice trembled with something colder than curiosity. "Because my mother has arranged it," he said. "Because in 3 days I am meant to announce my engagement to her before half the county." The words struck Eleanor like a slap, though she had known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that a duke's life was never as simple as a cottage and two people pretending the world outside did not exist. She had known it, and she had let herself forget it anyway, because forgetting had felt like happiness. "You already have a wife," she said, and her voice did not shake now. It came out steady, plain, undeniable. "I am your wife, Gideon. Have you forgotten the vicar, and the little chapel with the broken bell, and the promise you made me with your own hand upon the book?" Somewhere down the corridor a door opened, throwing a thin blade of candlelight across the floor, and Eleanor saw his face for the first time since the darkness had swallowed them both. He looked at her the way a man looks at a ghost he loves and fears in equal measure. "I have not forgotten," he said. "I have not spent a single hour forgetting. But you do not understand what waits for us if my mother learns the truth before I am ready to tell her." Eleanor felt something harden inside her, a resolve she had not known she carried until this moment. "Then tell her now," she said. "Tell her tonight, before another lie can grow between us." He shook his head, and it was not refusal so much as fear, the fear of a man who had spent his whole life being told that duty came before happiness, that a duke did not choose for himself, that love was a luxury afforded to other men. "There is more at stake than my mother's temper," he said. "There are debts. There are people in this house who depend on the income my mother believes the Calcott match will bring. If I break this now, without a plan, I may save my heart and lose everything else." Eleanor's eyes stung, though she refused to let the tears fall in front of him. "Then what am I to you?" she asked. "A secret you keep in a dark corridor? A wife you whisper to only when you believe I am someone else?" Before he could answer, footsteps sounded at the end of the hall, brisk and certain, the footsteps of someone who did not wander but arrived with purpose. Gideon's hand found Eleanor's again, gripping it hard enough to bruise, and in that grip she felt everything he could not say aloud. "Go," he breathed. "Please, not like this, not tonight." She wanted to refuse him. She wanted to stand in that corridor and let whoever approached find them together, hand in hand, and let the truth spill out like water from a broken jug, impossible to gather back. But something in his eyes, some old fear she remembered from the cottage days, when he had woken from dreams he would not describe, stopped her. She slipped from his grasp and disappeared through the servant's door just as the footsteps rounded the corner, and she pressed her back to the cold stone on the other side, her heart hammering, listening. "Gideon," a woman's voice said, sharp and clipped. "Why do you linger in the dark like a thief in your own house?" "I was walking," he said, and Eleanor could hear the effort it took him to steady his voice, thinking of the engagement. "There is nothing to think of," the woman said, and Eleanor recognized the voice now, the Dowager Duchess, Gideon's mother, a woman whose reputation for coldness reached even the servants' quarters. "The contracts are drawn. Lady Vivian arrives in 2 days to finalize the details before the ball. You will smile, you will dance with her, and you will remember what your father built with his own hands, so that his son does not lose it through sentiment." "I remember," Gideon said quietly. "See that you do," his mother replied, and her footsteps retreated the way they had come, leaving silence behind them. Eleanor stood in the dark of the servants' passage for a long while after the sound faded, one hand pressed against her mouth to keep from making a sound. She thought of the cottage, of the man who had introduced himself simply as Gideon Ash, a name that hid a title the way a plain coat hides a scar. She thought of the morning he had asked her to marry him, kneeling in a field of wildflowers with no ring but a length of ribbon tied around her finger, because he had nothing else to give her yet. She had believed, in that field, that love was the only inheritance either of them needed. Now she understood how little she had known of the world he came from, and how much that world intended to take from her before it would ever let her keep him. She made her way back to the small room she had been given among the seamstresses, a room far from the grand chambers where a duchess ought to sleep, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. A knock came at the door, soft and hesitant. She opened it to find Mrs. Whitfield, the housekeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and a kind heart who had never asked too many questions about the new seamstress who arrived with no letters of reference and a manner too refined for her station. "You look as though you have seen a spirit," Mrs. Whitfield said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. Eleanor tried to smile, but it did not reach her eyes. "Perhaps I have," she said. Mrs. Whitfield studied her for a long moment, and something in her expression suggested she understood more than she let on. "This house keeps its secrets close," she said. "But secrets have a way of finding daylight, whether we are ready or not. If you carry one, my dear, I hope you carry it wisely." Eleanor said nothing, only nodded, and after a moment, Mrs. Whitfield left her alone with the candle guttering low, and the weight of everything unsaid pressing down upon her chest. She lay awake long into the night, replaying his words in the dark corridor, the way his voice had broken on her name, the way his hand had trembled even as it held her firmly. She did not doubt that he loved her. She doubted only whether love, in a house built on debts and duty, would be enough to save either of them. 2 days, she thought. 2 days until Lady Vivian arrived to finalize an engagement to a man who was already married. 2 days to decide whether she would remain hidden in the shadows of his house, waiting for a truth he was too afraid to speak, or whether she would step into the light herself and force the world to see her as she was. She rose before dawn, dressed in her plain gray gown, and went to her work in the sewing room as though nothing had changed, her needle moving steadily through fine silk meant for another woman's wedding gown, her mind far away in a field of wildflowers that no longer felt like it belonged to her. The other seamstresses chattered around her about the coming ball, about the grand gowns being prepared for Lady Vivian's arrival, about how fortunate the Colcott family was to secure such a match. Eleanor kept her eyes on her stitches and said nothing, though every word cut a little deeper than the last. One of the younger girls, a bright-eyed seamstress named Charlotte, leaned close and asked if she had heard the news of the engagement, her voice full of the kind of excitement reserved for weddings that were not one's own to mourn. "It is a fine match, is it not?" Charlotte said, threading a needle with quick fingers. "A duke and the daughter of an earl. My mother says such a marriage will bring prosperity back to this house within the year." Eleanor forced a small nod, though her throat felt tight. "Perhaps it will," she said, and the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. By midday, word had spread through the servants' hall that the Duke had been seen wandering the corridors alone the night before, restless and distracted, and speculation ran wild as to the cause. Some whispered that he feared the marriage. Others said he simply missed his father, gone 2 winters now, and felt the weight of the title more heavily with each passing season. No one guessed the truth, and Eleanor found herself grateful for their ignorance even as it isolated her further, a woman carrying the heaviest secret in the house with no one to share its burden. She thought often, as she worked, of the cottage where it had all begun, of the man who had come to her with bruised knuckles and a borrowed name, claiming only to be a traveler recovering from an accident on the road. She had nursed him through fever without knowing he was heir to one of the great houses of the county, and by the time she learned the truth, her heart had already given itself away completely. He had begged her forgiveness for the deception, had sworn that his name meant nothing beside the truth of his feelings for her, and she had believed him, because in the small, quiet world of that cottage, nothing beyond the 2 of them had seemed to matter at all. Now she understood, with a clarity that ached, that the world beyond the cottage had never stopped waiting for him, patient and unyielding, ready to reclaim him the moment he returned. As the afternoon light faded, Eleanor set aside her needle and looked out the narrow window of the sewing room toward the drive, where in 2 days a carriage would arrive bearing a woman who believed herself the future duchess of this house. She did not hate Lady Vivian, not yet, for she did not know her, and some quiet instinct told Eleanor that the other woman might be as much a prisoner of this arrangement as she herself had become. But instinct was not certainty, and certainty was the one thing Eleanor could no longer afford to live without. But as she worked, a new thought took root inside her, quiet and stubborn as a seed beneath frozen ground. She had not crossed half a county and left behind everything she knew to become a secret. She had not spoken her vows before God and a broken bell to spend her life disappearing through servants' doors. Whatever came next, she resolved, she would not vanish quietly. She would not let his fear decide her fate for her. The Duke of Ashbourne had called her someone else's in the dark, without knowing it was her at all. Eleanor intended to make certain that when the truth finally came to light, no one in that house would ever mistake her for anyone but exactly who she was, his wife. A carriage wheel snapped on the eastern road, and Eleanor found herself running toward the sound before she even understood why her feet had carried her there. It was early morning, 2 days after the corridor, and she had been sent with a basket of mending to the gatehouse when the shout went up from the drive. She rounded the hedge to see a fine black carriage tilted at an angle in the mud, its wheels shattered, and a young woman climbing out through the door with remarkable composure for someone who had nearly been thrown from her seat. "Is anyone injured?" Eleanor called, hurrying forward, forgetting for a moment that she was meant to remain unseen and unremarkable in this house. The young woman turned, and Eleanor recognized her instantly from the whispered descriptions passed through the servants' hall. Lady Vivian Colcott stood before her, golden-haired and pale with shock, but unharmed, brushing mud from her traveling gown with hands that trembled only slightly. "No one is hurt," Vivian said, though her voice carried an odd note beneath the shock, something almost like relief. "My coachman says the wheel struck a stone buried in the road. We were fortunate it happened so close to the house." Eleanor helped her to steady ground and offered her arm, and Vivian took it without hesitation, studying Eleanor's face with a curiosity that seemed out of place for a lady addressing a servant. "You are not one of the housemaids," Vivian said. "Your bearing is wrong for it, if you will forgive me for saying so." Eleanor felt her face warm. "I am a seamstress, my lady," she said carefully, "nothing more." Vivian studied her a moment longer, then let the matter drop, allowing Eleanor to guide her toward the house, while servants rushed out to see to the broken carriage and the frightened horses. As they walked, Vivian glanced back once at the wreckage and murmured something Eleanor almost missed entirely. "Perhaps it is an omen," Vivian said quietly, more to herself than to Eleanor. "Perhaps the road itself does not wish me to arrive." Eleanor said nothing, though the words lodged themselves in her memory like a splinter she could not quite work free. Inside the house, the arrival caused a great commotion, and Eleanor was quickly dismissed from Vivian's side once the housekeeper and a proper lady's maid appeared to fuss over the young noblewoman. Eleanor returned to her sewing room, her basket of mending forgotten in the drive, her thoughts consumed by the strange sadness she had glimpsed in Vivian's eyes, a sadness that did not belong to a woman arriving to secure the match of the season. That evening, Gideon found her. She was alone in the small garden behind the kitchens, the one place in the house where the seamstresses were permitted to walk after their work was finished, when she heard his footsteps on the gravel path. She did not turn at first, though her whole body recognized his approach the way a compass recognizes north. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low, careful, glancing back toward the house as though afraid of being seen. "I have thought of nothing but you since the corridor. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I have been a coward, and I know it. And I have come to tell you that I mean to end this deception, whatever it costs me." She turned to face him then, and in the fading light his face looked older than she remembered, worn thin by 2 days of a burden he had carried alone for far too long. "What has changed?" she asked, though hope stirred in her chest despite her efforts to guard against it. "I watched Vivian arrive today," he said. "I watched her climb from that wrecked carriage with such quiet dread in her eyes, and I understood, perhaps for the first time, that she is as trapped in this arrangement as I am. Neither of us chose it. Neither of us wants it. And I will not build my happiness, or hide my marriage, upon her unhappiness as well." Eleanor stepped closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion etched around his eyes, close enough to remember why she had fallen in love with a man who called himself Gideon Ash, and asked for nothing but her company in a quiet cottage garden. "Then tell your mother," she said. "Tell her tonight." He shook his head slowly, though it was not the same refusal as before. "Not yet," he said. "If I tell her without a plan for the debts she believes this marriage will solve, she will fight me with everything she has, and she will not fight fairly. She has connections in the county, solicitors who owe her favors, magistrates who dine at her table. I need time to secure another path before I hand her the weapon of my desperation." Eleanor's jaw tightened, old frustration rising again despite his changed tone. "How much time?" she asked. "A fortnight, perhaps less," he said. "I have written to a solicitor in London. a man my father trusted, about restructuring the estate's debts through the sale of certain lands we no longer farm. If it succeeds, I will no longer need Vivian's dowry to save this house, and I can tell my mother the truth without fear of losing everything I am meant to protect. And if it fails? Eleanor asked. Then I will tell her anyway, he said, and there was a new steadiness in his voice that had not been there in the corridor. I promise you, Eleanor, I will not spend my life whispering to you in the dark like a man ashamed of his own wife. You deserve better than shadows. She wanted to believe him completely, wanted to let the words wrap around her like a blanket against the cold uncertainty of the past 2 days, but caution had become a habit she could not easily set aside. A fortnight, she repeated, and in that time I am to remain your secret, sewing gowns for the very woman my husband is expected to marry. I know how much I ask of you, he said, reaching for her hand. I know it is not fair, but I would rather ask you to wait a fortnight in shadow than force you into a battle we are not yet prepared to win. She let him take her hand, though she did not fully relax into the touch. There is something else, she said. Lady Vivian said a strange thing today, after the accident. She called it an omen, as though she herself feared the very match your mother has arranged. I do not think she wishes this marriage any more than we do. Gideon's brow furrowed in thought. If that is true, he said slowly, then perhaps we are not as alone in this as I believed. Perhaps not, Eleanor agreed. But we cannot know for certain unless one of us finds the courage to ask her directly, and I do not think that duty falls to you. He looked at her with something like admiration then, mixed with worry. You would speak with her? He asked. Knowing what she represents to this house? I would speak with her because she may be as trapped as we are, Eleanor said, and because I would rather understand my enemy, if she is one, than remain blind to her simply because I fear what she means to take from me. Gideon lifted her hand to his lips, a gesture so tender it nearly broke the careful composure she had built over the past 2 days. 2 weeks, he said again, as though repeating it might make the promise more solid. Then I will end this hiding, whatever the cost. She nodded, though as she watched him disappear back toward the house, slipping through a side door before any servant could notice his absence, a quiet unease settled over her that she could not fully name. 2 weeks was a long time for secrets to survive in a house full of watchful eyes, and a mother determined to see her plans fulfilled. She returned to her small room that night and lay awake once more, turning over Vivian's strange words about omens and unwanted roads, wondering what secrets the golden-haired lady carried beneath her composed exterior. Eleanor had come to this house believing herself the only woman trapped by circumstances beyond her choosing. She was beginning to suspect she was not alone at all, and that realization, frightening as it was, planted the first seed of a plan that might yet save them all. The following morning, opportunity arrived sooner than Eleanor expected. She was summoned to Lady Vivian's chambers to take measurements for alterations to a gown damaged in the carriage accident, and she arrived to find the young noblewoman standing alone at her window, staring out toward the same eastern road where the wheel had broken 2 mornings before. You came quickly, Vivian said without turning. I confess I asked for you specifically. There is something honest in your face that I have not found among the rest of this household. Eleanor set down her sewing basket carefully, her heart beginning to beat faster. I am only a seamstress, my lady, she said again, though the words felt thinner each time she spoke them. Vivian finally turned to face her, and in her eyes Eleanor saw not the confidence of a future duchess, but the quiet desperation of a woman, cornered by circumstances she had never chosen for herself. Perhaps, Vivian said softly, or perhaps you are exactly the person I need to speak with honestly, before it is too late for either of us to change what is coming. Eleanor's hands stilled over the gown she had begun to unfold. What is it you wish to tell me, my lady? She asked carefully, aware that whatever answer came next might change everything. Vivian crossed the room and lowered herself onto the window seat, gesturing for Eleanor to sit as well, an invitation so unusual between a noblewoman and a seamstress that Eleanor hesitated before accepting it. I did not choose this match, Vivian said plainly. My father arranged it before I had any say in the matter, before I had even met the Duke beyond a single dinner 3 years ago when we were both little more than children in the eyes of our parents. He believes an alliance with Ashbourne will restore our family's standing after certain losses at cards left our own accounts thinner than anyone outside the family knows. Eleanor listened carefully, saying nothing, letting the young woman continue. I do not dislike the Duke, Vivian went on. He was courteous at dinner, and I have heard nothing cruel spoken of him in society. But courtesy is not affection, and I fear a marriage built only on courtesy will leave us both hollow within a year. I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the carriage accident might delay things long enough for me to find some way to speak honestly with my father before the contracts are finalized. Eleanor's chest tightened with a mixture of sympathy and something closer to hope, though she dared not let it show fully on her face. "Have you spoken with him?" she asked. Vivian shook her head, golden curls trembling with the motion. "He will not hear it. He says duty comes before feeling. That feeling is a luxury for women who do not understand the weight of debt hanging over a household." I have heard those words so many times I could recite them in my sleep. Eleanor thought of Gideon's own words, so similar in shape though spoken from the opposite side of the same arrangement, and she felt the strange, uncomfortable kinship of two people bound by circumstances neither had chosen. "There is someone else, is there not?" Eleanor asked gently, guessing at the source of the sorrow she had glimpsed in Vivian's eyes since the moment they met on the muddy drive. Vivian's composure cracked for just a moment, her eyes glistening before she blinked the emotion away with practiced control. "How did you know?" she whispered. "Because I have seen that same sorrow before," Eleanor said quietly, thinking of her own reflection in whatever mirror might show the truth of her heart. "It is not easily hidden, even by those skilled at hiding everything else." Vivian was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her folded hands. "His name is Nathaniel," she finally admitted. "He manages the accounts for a shipping merchant in the city, a good and honest man, though he has no title and no fortune to speak of. My father would never consent to such a match, not while Ashbourne remains available and willing." "Willing," Eleanor repeated carefully, testing the word. Vivian looked up at her sharply, some instinct sparking behind her eyes. "You say that word as though you doubt it," she said. "Do you know something of the Duke's willingness that I do not?" Eleanor's heart pounded against her ribs, and for a moment she considered retreating into silence, protecting the secret a little longer as Gideon had asked. But looking at Vivian's face, so full of quiet desperation and a hope she was almost afraid to feel, Eleanor understood that silence now might cost them all more than honesty would. "I know that the Duke does not wish this marriage either," Eleanor said slowly, choosing each word with great care. "And I believe, if given the chance, he would welcome any path that spared you both from a union neither of you desires." Vivian's breath caught. "How can you possibly know such a thing?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor met her gaze steadily, feeling the weight of the secret pressing against her ribs like a held breath finally ready to release. "Because," she said, "his heart already belongs to someone else, just as yours does." The silence that followed stretched long and fragile between them, and Eleanor watched understanding dawn slowly across Vivian's face, followed by something that looked remarkably like relief. "Then we are not enemies at all," Vivian said softly, almost wondering. "We are simply two women caught in the same net, cast by people who never once asked what either of us wanted." "No," Eleanor agreed. "We are not enemies. But we must be careful, my lady. If your father or the Dowager Duchess learns of this conversation before we are ready, the consequences may fall heaviest upon those with the least power to protect themselves." Vivian nodded, understanding immediately, and something like a fragile alliance formed silently between them in that quiet room, unspoken but unmistakably real. "Will you help me?" Vivian asked. "Not merely for my own sake, but because I believe, whatever your connection to the Duke may be, you wish for his happiness as much as I wish for mine." Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering, weighing the fortnight Gideon had asked of her against the fragile opportunity now sitting before her in the form of a frightened young noblewoman, willing to risk everything for honesty. "I will help you," Eleanor said finally. "But we must move carefully, and we must trust each other completely. For we have very little time before the ball forces all of our secrets into the light, whether we are ready or not." The letter arrived sealed with black wax, and the moment Mrs. Whitfield placed it in Eleanor's hands, she knew something in the house had shifted beyond repair. "Find the Duke immediately," Mrs. Whitfield whispered, her face pale, her eyes darting toward the main staircase where the Dowager Duchess had disappeared only minutes before with a face like thunder. "Tell him his mother knows." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. "Knows what?" she asked, though some deep certainty already answered the question before Mrs. Whitfield could speak. "Everything," the housekeeper said. "A solicitor's clerk in London mentioned the marriage register to an acquaintance who happened to dine with a friend of the Dowager's. Word travels faster than any of us can outrun it, my dear. She knows you are his wife, and she is not a woman who forgives being deceived under her own roof." Eleanor did not wait to hear more. She abandoned the mending in her hands and hurried through the servants' corridors toward the east wing, where Gideon kept his study, praying she would reach him before his mother did. She found him already standing, his face ashen, a letter of his own crumpled in his fist. He looked up as she entered, and the expression on his face told her everything, before either of them spoke a single word. "She knows," he said quietly. "My mother summoned me not 10 minutes ago. She has proof, Eleanor. A copy of the marriage register, obtained through connections I did not know she possessed. She means to have it annulled before the ball, on grounds of deception, and she has already spoken with a magistrate, who owes her a debt of gratitude for favors long past." Eleanor's legs felt suddenly weak, and she gripped the edge of his desk for support. "Can she truly do such a thing?" she asked. "We were married honestly, before God and witnesses." "Honesty means little against connections and desperation," Gideon said bitterly. "She claims I married beneath my station under false pretenses, having concealed my title from you, which she argues invalidates the sincerity of your consent. It is a thin argument, but with the right magistrate and enough pressure, thin arguments have won stranger battles than this one." The door to the study opened without a knock, and the Dowager Duchess swept inside with the cold authority of a woman who had never once doubted her right to control every corner of her household. "So it is true," she said, her eyes fixing on Eleanor with a contempt so sharp it felt almost physical. "The seamstress, my son's secret wife, hidden among the sewing baskets like some shameful stain he could not bring himself to remove." "Mother," Gideon said, stepping between them, his voice hard in a way Eleanor had never heard from him before. "You will speak to her with respect, or you will not speak to her at all in my presence." The Dowager's eyes flashed, though her composure did not fully break. "Respect," she repeated, as though the word itself offended her. "You ask me to respect a woman who deceived her way into a title she was never meant to hold, who has spent months sewing gowns for the very family she secretly married into, all while allowing the Calcott arrangement to proceed as though nothing stood in its way. Do you understand what you have done, Gideon? Do you understand what this house stands to lose?" "I understand perfectly," Gideon said, his jaw tight. "I have understood it since the day I married her, and I chose her anyway, because I would rather lose a fortune than lose the only happiness I have ever known that was not built upon obligation." The Dowager's face contorted with something between fury and heartbreak, and for a moment Eleanor glimpsed the fear beneath the anger, the terror of a woman who had spent years holding a crumbling house together, through sheer force of will, and could not bear to watch it fall apart now, at the final moment. "Your father built this house from nothing," the Dowager said, her voice lower now, almost pleading. "He fought creditors and scandal, and the whispers of lesser men who believed our family beneath their notice, and he left it to you whole, trusting you to protect it. If this marriage becomes known before the debts are settled, we will lose everything, Gideon. The tenants who depend on us for their livelihoods, the servants who have given their lives to this household, all of it will collapse, and it will be your name attached to the ruin." Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle over the room like a physical thing, and despite everything, she found she could not entirely dismiss the Dowager's fear as mere cruelty. There was truth beneath the harshness, a truth that frightened her more than the woman's contempt ever could. "Then help me find another way," Gideon said, his voice steadying with sudden resolve. "I have already written to Pemberton in London about restructuring the debts through the sale of the northern fields we no longer farm. Give me a fortnight, as I asked before this letter arrived, and I will present you with a solution that does not require sacrificing either this house or my marriage." The Dowager studied him for a long moment, and Eleanor watched something shift behind her eyes, calculation replacing pure fury, though the coldness remained. "A fortnight," the Dowager repeated slowly, "and if your solicitor's scheme fails, as such schemes so often do, then I will face the consequences myself," Gideon said. "But I will not annul a marriage made in good faith to satisfy a debt that is not Eleanor's to pay." The Dowager's gaze shifted to Eleanor then, sharp and assessing, measuring her the way one might measure an opponent across a chessboard. Eleanor forced herself to meet that gaze without flinching, though her heart pounded so hard she feared it might be heard across the room. "You have nothing to say for yourself?" the Dowager asked, her tone somewhere between challenge and genuine curiosity. "I have everything to say," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. "I did not seek a title when I married your son. I did not know he was a duke until after the vows were spoken, and by then it did not matter to me, because I had already given my heart to the man, not the position he held. If you believe I married him for gain, you are mistaken, and I am prepared to prove it however you require." The Dowager's expression flickered, something almost like surprise crossing her features before the coldness reasserted itself. "Pretty words," she said, "but pretty words have never paid a single debt in the history of this house." "Then let me offer more than words," Eleanor said, an idea forming even as she spoke it aloud. born of desperation and the quiet courage she had been gathering since the corridor 2 days before. Allow the fortnight your son requests. If his solicitor's plan succeeds, this marriage costs the house nothing at all, and you will have lost nothing by granting us the time. But if it fails, I will step aside myself, quietly, without scandal, so that Gideon may pursue whatever arrangement is necessary to save this family, even if that arrangement breaks my own heart beyond repair. Eleanor, Gideon said sharply, turning to her with something like horror in his eyes, you do not need to offer such a thing. I offer it because it may be the only way to buy us the time we need, Eleanor said quietly, not looking away from the dowager. And because I trust the solicitor's plan will succeed, and this promise will cost me nothing in the end. The dowager considered this for a long, tense moment, her sharp eyes moving between Eleanor and her son as though weighing the sincerity of every word spoken. Finally, she gave a single, curt nod. A fortnight, she said, not a day more, and you will remain hidden until the matter is resolved one way or another, seamstress. I will not have this scandal reach the ears of society before I have decided how best to manage its consequences. She swept from the room without another word, leaving the heavy silence of her absence behind her, and Eleanor finally allowed herself to breathe, though the relief was thin and fragile, a temporary reprieve rather than any true victory. Why would you offer such a thing? Gideon asked once they were alone, his voice full of a pain that matched her own. To simply step aside, as though you were nothing more than an obstacle to be removed if convenient. Because I needed her to believe the offer was real enough to consider, Eleanor said, though her voice trembled now that the danger had passed. I do not intend to keep that promise, Gideon. I intend for your solicitor's plan to succeed, and for your mother to have no cause to ever ask it of me again. He crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her the way a man holds something he fears losing more than his own life. I will not let it come to that, he murmured into her hair. Whatever happens with the estate, I will not lose you to satisfy my mother's fears. Eleanor held on to him tightly, drawing strength from the solid warmth of him, though a new worry had already begun to take root in her mind. We are not the only ones caught in this arrangement, she reminded him gently, pulling back enough to look into his eyes. Lady Vivian carries her own secret, one that may prove useful if we are brave enough to bring it into the light at the right moment. Gideon's brow furrowed with cautious hope. You spoke with her? He asked. I did, Eleanor said. She loves another man, Gideon. A man named Nathaniel who holds no title but holds her heart completely. She wishes for release from this arrangement as much as we do, and she has agreed to help us, if we are willing to trust her in return. Gideon exhaled slowly, something like relief passing across his tired features. Then perhaps we are not fighting this battle entirely alone after all, he said. We are not, Eleanor agreed, but we must move carefully, and we must move quickly, for your mother's fortnight will pass whether we are ready or not, and I do not intend to let it pass without a plan of our own standing firmly in place. Later that same evening, Gideon called for Mr. Pemberton, the family solicitor, requesting his presence at the earliest possible hour, and by the following morning a thin, sharp-eyed man in a traveling coat had arrived at the house, summoned from London on urgent business he had not yet been told the full nature of. They met in the study, the same room where the dowager's fury had unfolded only a day before, and Eleanor was permitted to remain, though she stood quietly near the window, aware that her presence in such a meeting was unusual enough to draw comment if word ever spread beyond these walls. Your Grace, Pemberton said, settling into a chair with a leather satchel of papers balanced upon his knees. I received your letter regarding the northern fields, and I confess the timing proves fortunate, for I have already begun making inquiries on your behalf, though I did not expect to present them so soon. Tell me what you have found, Gideon said, leaning forward with an intensity that betrayed how much rested upon the solicitor's next words. Pemberton opened his satchel and withdrew a sheaf of documents, spreading them across the desk with practiced efficiency. There is a merchant in Bristol, he explained, a man who has made his fortune in shipping and now wishes to expand into land holdings for the prestige it affords his family. He has expressed genuine interest in the northern fields, provided the soil surveys confirm what our preliminary reports suggest, that the land remains fertile despite years of neglect under your father's later management. And the sum he offers? Gideon asked. Pemberton named a figure that made Eleanor's breath catch, a sum substantial enough to address a significant portion of the debts weighing upon the estate, though not the whole of it. It is not enough on its own, Pemberton admitted, seeing the flicker of disappointment cross Gideon's face. But combined with a reduction in certain unnecessary expenditures, and perhaps a renegotiation of terms with your primary creditors, who I believe would rather receive steady payment over time than risk receiving nothing at all should the estate fall into deeper crisis. I believe we can construct a path forward that does not require the Calcott dowry to sustain this household." Gideon sat back in his chair, some of the tension easing from his shoulders for the first time in days. "How quickly can such arrangements be finalized?" he asked. Pemberton considered the question carefully. The land sale itself could be completed within a fortnight, provided the surveys confirm favorable conditions and the merchant does not withdraw his interest. The renegotiation with creditors will take longer, perhaps a month or more, though I can secure preliminary agreements from the most pressing among them within the same fortnight, enough to demonstrate good faith and buy further time for the remainder. "A fortnight," Gideon repeated, exchanging a glance with Eleanor across the room. It seemed the number followed them wherever they turned, a deadline pressing from every direction at once. "I will need your signature on several documents to proceed," Pemberton said, "and I will need to arrange for the soil surveys to begin immediately if we are to have any hope of completing the sale within your mother's stated timeline." He paused, glancing briefly toward Eleanor with the careful neutrality of a man who had noticed far more than he intended to comment upon. "I gather there are personal matters entwined with this financial urgency as well, Your Grace, though it is not my place to inquire further." "There are," Gideon said simply, offering no further explanation. And to his credit, Pemberton did not press for one. The solicitor gathered his papers and rose to leave, promising to return within days with the necessary documents for signature. And once he had gone, Gideon turned to Eleanor with something that looked almost like hope kindling behind his tired eyes. "It may work," he said, "if the surveys confirm what Pemberton believes, and if the creditors accept the terms he proposes, we may yet save this house without sacrificing anything that matters most to either of us." Eleanor crossed the room and took his hands in hers, feeling the tremor of exhaustion and cautious optimism running through him. "Then we have a plan," she said. "A fragile one, perhaps, but a plan nonetheless, and that is more than we possessed only yesterday." They stood together in the quiet study as the afternoon light shifted across the papers Pemberton had left behind, and for a moment, the weight pressing upon them both seemed to lift just enough to let them breathe freely, though neither dared believe the danger had fully passed. That evening, as the household settled into its usual quiet rhythms, Eleanor sat by her small window and composed a careful letter to be delivered discreetly to Lady Vivian, outlining the danger that had arrived with the Dowager's discovery and the narrow window of time now remaining before everything might collapse or finally find its footing. She sealed it with trembling hands, aware that from this moment forward, there could be no retreat into shadows, no more quiet hiding in servants' corridors. Before she extinguished her candle that night, Eleanor allowed herself a rare moment to remember the cottage garden where this journey had first begun, the scent of wild roses climbing the fence, the sound of Gideon's laughter when he did not yet carry the full weight of a title upon his shoulders. She wondered if such simplicity could ever exist for them again, or whether love, once tangled in the affairs of great houses and desperate mothers, was forever changed by the battles required to protect it. She fell asleep with the letter to Vivian sealed and waiting on her small table, and she dreamed, for the first time in days, not of dark corridors and cold accusations, but of a field of wildflowers stretching endlessly toward a horizon unmarked by debt or duty, a place where a man had once knelt before her with nothing but a ribbon and an honest heart, and where, despite everything the world had thrown between them since, some quiet part of her still believed they might find their way back. A single sheet of paper, folded twice and tucked beneath a bolt of blue silk, nearly cost Eleanor everything before the fortnight had even reached its midpoint. She found it while sorting fabric for a gown Vivian had requested as cover for their continued meetings, and the moment she unfolded it and recognized her own handwriting staring back at her, her stomach dropped with dread. It was the letter she had written to Vivian days before, detailing the Dowager's discovery and the fragile plan taking shape to save them all. A letter that should have been delivered and destroyed, not left carelessly among fabric where any curious hand might find it. Someone had read it. Someone had folded it back precisely as it had been, before slipping it beneath the silk, perhaps hoping it would go unnoticed, or perhaps as a warning that it had already been seen. Eleanor's hands trembled as she tucked the letter into her sleeve and hurried to find Vivian, her mind racing through every possibility, none of them comforting. "We must be more careful," Eleanor said breathlessly once she found Vivian alone in the small parlor set aside for her use during her stay. "Someone found this among the fabric meant for your gown. I do not know who, or how much they may have read, or whether they intend to use it against us." Vivian's face paled as she took the letter and reread her own name written in Eleanor's careful hand. This could ruin everything before Pemberton's plan has even had time to succeed, she said, her voice tight with fear. If my father learns I have been conspiring to escape this marriage, he will remove me from this house within the hour and lock me away until the wedding, regardless of what either of us wishes. They agreed to move more cautiously, communicating now only through brief, coded conversations during fittings, never committing their plans to paper again. But the fear of discovery settled over Eleanor like a second skin she could not shed. Every servant who passed her in the corridor seemed to look at her a moment too long. Every glance from the Dowager Duchess felt sharper, more knowing, than it had before. 3 days later, the truth of who had found the letter revealed itself in the worst possible manner. Eleanor was summoned to the Dowager's private sitting room, a summons that filled her with immediate dread, for she had not been called before the Dowager alone since the confrontation in Gideon's study. She arrived to find the older woman seated stiffly by the fire, the folded letter resting openly upon the table between them, no longer any pretense of secrecy remaining. "Sit," the Dowager commanded, and Eleanor obeyed, though every instinct urged her to flee instead. "You have been busy," the Dowager said, her voice cold and measured, "conspiring with Lady Vivian to unravel an arrangement that took my late husband's careful planning and considerable effort to secure. Do you understand what you have risked, not only for yourself, but for her as well? Should her father learn of this correspondence, he would not simply be angry, he would ruin her prospects entirely, and quite possibly ruin yours in the process, seamstress or duchess as you may claim to be." Eleanor forced herself to remain steady, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "I sought only to understand whether Lady Vivian shared our wish to avoid a marriage neither she nor your son desires," she said. "If that constitutes conspiracy, then I confess to it freely, for I believe honesty between us serves this house better than the silence you have asked me to keep." The Dowager studied her for a long moment, and something unreadable passed behind her sharp eyes, an expression Eleanor could not quite name. "You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish," the Dowager said finally. "Perhaps both. I have not decided which frightens me more." "I would rather be brave and foolish than silent and afraid," Eleanor replied, surprising herself with the boldness of her own words. To her astonishment, something almost like the ghost of a smile flickered across the Dowager's face, before vanishing just as quickly, replaced once more by her usual severity. "I did not read the entirety of your letter," the Dowager admitted after a long pause. "I read enough to understand its contents, but I have not shown it to anyone, nor do I intend to, provided you can assure me that whatever scheme you and Lady Vivian have concocted does not further endanger this family's already precarious standing." Eleanor blinked in surprise, hardly daring to trust the sudden shift in the Dowager's tone. "Why would you protect us?" she asked cautiously, "after everything you have said about the danger I represent to this house." The Dowager's gaze drifted toward the fire, and for a moment the hardness in her expression softened into something closer to weariness, the exhaustion of a woman who had spent decades holding together a household through sheer force of will, with little room left for softer feelings. "Because I was young once too," the Dowager said quietly. "I did not marry for love, seamstress. I married for duty, as was expected of me, and I spent the better part of my youth wondering what it might have felt like to choose for myself instead. I do not say this to excuse my harshness toward you, for the danger to this house remains very real regardless of my private regrets. But I confess I have watched my son these past days, watched the way he moves through this house like a man finally awake after years of quiet resignation, and I cannot entirely bring myself to be the one who extinguishes that light again, however much caution demands it of me." Eleanor's throat tightened with unexpected emotion, and she found herself studying the Dowager with new eyes, seeing beneath the coldness a woman who had perhaps never been given the chance to be anything other than what duty required of her. "Then help us," Eleanor said softly. "Not merely by staying silent, but by standing with us when the truth finally comes to light. Your voice carries weight in this county that mine never could. If you stood beside Gideon when he speaks the truth, it would matter more than you know." The Dowager's expression hardened again, though not entirely back to its original severity. "I have not decided how far my sympathy extends," she said. "I will not promise what I am not yet certain I can deliver. But I will grant you this much, seamstress. I will not speak of what I have read, and I will watch how this fortnight unfolds before I decide where my loyalty ultimately rests." It was not the full alliance Eleanor had hoped for, but it was far more than she had expected walking into that room, and she left the Dowager's sitting room with a fragile, cautious hope taking root where fear had lived only moments before. She found Gideon that evening in the garden, and when she told him of the conversation, disbelief and hope warred openly across his face. My mother said such a thing? He asked, as though he could scarcely credit it. She has never once, in all my years, spoken of regret regarding her own marriage. Perhaps she has simply never had reason to speak of it before now, Eleanor said. Perhaps watching us has reminded her of something she buried long ago, for her own survival within a life that offered her little choice. Gideon was quiet for a long moment, staring up at the darkening sky above the garden. If she stands with us, he said slowly, it changes everything. Her voice in this county could silence half the gossip before it ever begins, and it would make Vivian's father far less likely to retaliate against his daughter if the Dowager Duchess herself signals her approval of how this matter unfolds. Then we must give her reason to trust that approval will not cost her everything she has fought to protect, Eleanor said. Pemberton's plan must succeed, and it must succeed convincingly, so that when the truth is finally spoken, there is no ruin left for anyone to fear. As if summoned by the thought itself, a messenger arrived at the garden gate the following morning bearing a letter from Pemberton, and Gideon tore it open with hands that shook slightly, scanning the contents while Eleanor watched, holding her breath. The soil surveys are complete, Gideon read aloud, his voice rising with cautious excitement. The merchant remains interested, and Pemberton believes the sale can be finalized within the week, well ahead of the fortnight we were granted. He has also secured preliminary agreements from 2 of our largest creditors, willing to accept extended payment terms provided the land sale proceeds as planned. Eleanor felt relief wash through her so powerfully her knees nearly buckled beneath her. Then it is working, she breathed. Everything Pemberton promised, it is actually working. It is working, Gideon repeated, pulling her into his arms and holding her tightly, as though needing to feel the reality of the good news against his own chest before he could fully believe it. We may yet reach the ball with nothing left to fear, Eleanor. We may yet stand before all of society and speak the truth without watching this house crumble around us as punishment for our honesty. But even as hope bloomed brighter between them than it had in days, a quiet unease lingered at the edges of Eleanor's mind, a caution born of everything the past fortnight had taught her about how quickly fortune could turn against those who dared to hope too openly. The ball was still days away, and Lady Vivian's father remained an unknown variable in a plan that depended on far too many pieces falling perfectly into place. She said nothing of this worry to Gideon, allowing him this moment of unclouded relief, but she resolved privately to seek out Vivian again as soon as possible. For if Lord Colcott proved as immovable as his daughter feared, no amount of solicitor's paperwork or the Dowager's uncertain sympathy would be enough to save them from the confrontation still waiting at the end of this fragile, hopeful fortnight. She found her opportunity that same afternoon, when Vivian requested another fitting under the guise of adjusting the gown meant for the ball, and the 2 women spoke in low, careful voices while Eleanor pinned fabric that required no real alteration at all. The land sale moves forward, Eleanor said quietly, keeping her eyes on her work in case anyone glanced through the open door. There is real hope now that the debts can be settled without your dowry, but I fear for you still. Even if Gideon speaks the truth at the ball, your father may not release you from an engagement he has already announced to half the county. Vivian's expression clouded with a fear she had clearly been carrying alone. My father has already begun discussing terms with his own solicitor, she admitted. He speaks of settlements and properties as though I were a parcel of land to be transferred, rather than a daughter to be considered. If the engagement collapses without another suitable arrangement already prepared, I do not know what he will do. He may simply seek another title to attach me to, someone with fewer scruples than the Duke has shown. Have you spoken with Nathaniel of this danger? Eleanor asked gently. Vivian's hands stilled over the fabric she had been pretending to examine. I have not seen him in nearly a month, she confessed, her voice thick with longing carefully restrained. My father forbade further correspondence once the Colcott arrangement was announced. I do not even know if he remains in the city, or whether he has heard rumors of my coming marriage and believes I have simply accepted my fate. Eleanor considered this for a moment, an idea forming slowly in her mind. Write to him, she said finally, carefully, discreetly, through a servant you trust completely, rather than the regular post. If there is any hope of your father accepting an alternative match, it will require more than simply refusing the Duke. It will require another path already visible before the refusal is even spoken, just as Gideon required Pemberton's plan before he could risk defying his mother. Vivian's eyes brightened with cautious hope, the first genuine spark of optimism Eleanor had seen in her since their first conversation. You believe such a thing is possible, she asked, that my father might accept Nathaniel, given enough reason and enough time? I believe hope is worth the risk of trying, Eleanor said. We have little enough time remaining before the ball forces every hidden truth into the open. It would serve us all better if each of us walked into that evening with some alternative already prepared, rather than relying solely on the courage to refuse what has been arranged." Vivian nodded slowly, resolve settling over her features in place of fear. "I will write to him tonight," she said. "Through Margaret, my own maid, who has served my family since I was a child and would never betray my trust. Perhaps if Nathaniel can secure some advancement in his position before the ball, some proof of stability my father might find acceptable, there may yet be a path forward for us as well." As Eleanor finished the false alterations to the gown and gathered her things to leave, Vivian caught her hand, holding it with unexpected warmth. "I did not expect to find an ally in this house," Vivian said softly. "Certainly not in a seamstress with more courage than half the nobility I have known. Whatever happens at that ball, Eleanor, I will not forget what you have risked to help me." Eleanor squeezed her hand in return, feeling the fragile bond between them strengthen into something that felt, despite everything, remarkably like genuine friendship. "We are not so different, you and I," she said. "Two women who found love in places the world did not sanction for us, fighting to keep it against odds that seemed determined to separate us from our own hearts. If we cannot help each other through this, I do not know who could." The ballroom blazed with 1,000 candles, and somewhere beneath all that golden light, Eleanor stood pressed against a servant's doorway, watching the life she had married into unfold without her, wondering if she had the courage to step into it before the night was finished. The fortnight had passed in a blur of anxious waiting and cautious hope. Pemberton's land sale had closed successfully 3 days before. The creditors had accepted the proposed terms, and the estate now stood on steadier ground than it had known in years. Gideon had told his mother everything, laying the full financial picture before her with a confidence Eleanor had watched grow in him day by day, and though the Dowager Duchess had not offered warm approval, she had not moved to stop what was now set in motion either. Tonight, everything would be decided. Lord Colcott had arrived that afternoon to finalize the engagement contracts, believing this ball would mark the formal announcement his family had long anticipated. He did not yet know that his daughter had spent the past 2 weeks exchanging careful letters with a shipping merchant's clerk, or that the merchant clerk in question had, through a stroke of fortune Eleanor still considered nothing short of providence, recently been made a full partner in his firm after successfully securing a lucrative contract with a foreign trading house, a promotion that transformed him from an unsuitable match into a man of genuine, if modest, standing. Eleanor smoothed the front of the gown Mrs. Whitfield had insisted she wear tonight, a deep blue silk that had been quietly prepared over the past week under the pretense of alterations for another lady entirely. She did not look like a seamstress in it. She looked, for the first time since arriving at this house, like exactly what she was: a duchess. Gideon found her in the doorway just as the orchestra began a new set, his eyes widening at the sight of her before softening into something achingly tender. "You are certain?" he asked quietly, offering his arm. "Once we step into that room together, there is no retreating back into shadow. Whatever comes, we face it in full view of everyone who matters to this house and this county." "I have spent long enough in shadow," Eleanor said, taking his arm with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "I told you once I would not vanish quietly. I meant it then, and I mean it more tonight than ever." They stepped into the ballroom together, and for a moment no one noticed them at all, the crowd too absorbed in dancing and conversation to register the significance of the Duke entering with a woman in blue silk who was not the guest of honor everyone expected to see upon his arm. But the moment stretched only briefly before the first gasp rippled through the nearest cluster of guests, and from there the awareness spread like fire through dry grass, whispers multiplying until the orchestra itself faltered, and the dancing slowed to an uncertain halt. Lord Colcott pushed through the crowd first, his face reddening with confusion and rising anger. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying across the sudden hush of the room, "what is the meaning of this? Where is Lady Vivian? We are gathered here to announce an engagement, not to entertain unexplained guests upon your arm." Before Gideon could answer, the Dowager Duchess appeared at the edge of the gathered crowd, her expression unreadable, and beside her, unexpectedly, stood Vivian herself, dressed not in the pale gown intended for her formal presentation, but in a rich green that seemed to carry its own quiet defiance. "There will be no engagement announced tonight, Lord Colcott," Gideon said, his voice steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the silent ballroom. "I owe you and everyone gathered here an explanation, and I intend to give it honestly, whatever the cost to my own standing." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, curiosity and scandal mingling in equal measure as every eye in the room fixed upon the small cluster of people now standing at its center. "This is Eleanor," Gideon continued, turning to face the room fully, his hand tightening around hers as though drawing strength from the contact. "She is not merely a guest at this ball. She is my wife, married before witnesses nearly a year ago, in a small chapel far from this house, long before any arrangement with the Colcott family was ever proposed." The gasp that swept through the ballroom this time was audible, a collective intake of breath that seemed to suck the very air from the vast room. Lord Colcott's face drained of color before flushing dark red with fury. "You dare stand before me and my daughter," he sputtered, "having deceived this entire arrangement while already bound to another woman? This is an outrage beyond anything I have witnessed in 30 years of society, Your Grace. I will see this scandal reach every corner of the county before the week is finished." "Father," Vivian said suddenly, stepping forward from beside the Dowager Duchess, her voice trembling but determined. "Before you condemn the Duke, you must know that I share no grievance in this matter. I did not wish for this marriage any more than he did. We were both bound by arrangements neither of us chose, and I confess to you now, before all of society, that my own heart has long belonged to another." "Vivian," her father hissed, his voice dropping low with warning, though it carried clearly enough in the stunned silence of the room. "Do not say another word." "I will say every word," Vivian replied, and something in her voice had transformed entirely from the frightened young woman Eleanor had first met on the muddy drive weeks ago. "I have spent my whole life saying only what was expected of me, marrying where I was told, smiling when I was told to smile. I will not do so any longer, not when honesty stands so plainly before me tonight." She turned to the gathered crowd, and though her voice shook slightly, she did not falter. "I love a man named Nathaniel Cole," she declared, loudly enough for every guest to hear clearly. "He holds no title, but he holds more honor and kindness than any man of rank I have met in this county, and I would rather face scandal with him at my side than spend my life in comfortable misery, married to a man whose heart, as he has told you all tonight, already belongs to someone else." The ballroom erupted into a chaos of whispered scandal, fans fluttering rapidly as guests turned to their neighbors to exchange shocked commentary, and for a moment Eleanor feared the entire evening might collapse into unmanageable disorder. But then, unexpectedly, the Dowager Duchess stepped forward, raising her voice with the commanding authority that had governed this household for decades. "Enough," the Dowager said, and something in her tone silenced the room more effectively than any lesser voice could have managed. "I have known of my son's marriage for a fortnight now. I did not approve of the secrecy, and I confess I did not initially approve of the marriage itself. But I have watched my son these past weeks, and I have watched the woman he chose, and I tell you all now, before this entire gathering, that I have never seen him more certain of anything in his life than he is of her." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she could not fully hold back, the weight of the Dowager's public support landing with far greater force than she had ever expected to receive. "As for the estate's finances," the Dowager continued, addressing the room at large with brisk efficiency, "those who whisper that this marriage threatens the stability of this house may set their concerns aside. The land sale concluded successfully 3 days ago, and our creditors have agreed to generous terms. This house owes nothing to the Colcott family that a broken engagement could possibly endanger." Lord Colcott stood rigid amid the wreckage of his carefully laid plans, his face a mixture of fury and calculation, as he clearly weighed his remaining options. He turned to his daughter with a final, desperate attempt at authority. "You will retract this nonsense at once," he said. "You will apologize to this gathering, and we will speak no further of shipping clerks and broken engagements." "I will not," Vivian said quietly but firmly. "I am 23, Father. I have obeyed you my entire life, and I will continue to honor you as my father for the rest of my days. But I will not marry a man I do not love simply to satisfy an arrangement that serves your pride more than my happiness." A new voice cut through the tension then, unfamiliar to most of the room but clearly recognized by Vivian, whose face transformed instantly with joyful disbelief. "Perhaps I might offer a word on the matter," the voice said, and the crowd parted to reveal a young man in a well-tailored but modest coat, his expression nervous but resolute as he made his way toward the center of the room. "Nathaniel," Vivian breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Forgive my uninvited arrival," Nathaniel said, addressing Lord Colcott directly with a respectful bow despite his obvious nerves. "Lady Vivian's maid informed me of tonight's ball and the danger it presented to us both. I could not stay away while her future was being decided without her voice, or mine, being heard." I am newly made a partner in my firm, sir, with an income that, while modest beside a duke's fortune, is respectable and growing steadily. I love your daughter completely, and I would spend the whole of my life proving myself worthy of the trust you might place in me, if you would only grant me the chance." The ballroom held its breath collectively as Lord Colcott studied the young man before him, his expression cycling through fury, calculation, and finally something that looked almost like reluctant consideration as he glanced toward his daughter's hopeful, pleading face. "We will discuss this privately," Lord Colcott said finally, his voice tight but no longer entirely closed to possibility. "Not here, before half the county's gossips, hungry for every detail they can carry home with them tonight." It was not full approval, but it was not the outright refusal Vivian had feared either, and relief flooded her features so visibly that several nearby guests actually smiled despite the scandal of the evening, charmed against their better judgment by the raw honesty unfolding before them. Gideon turned back to Eleanor then, and in front of the entire assembled county, he lifted her hand to his lips with a tenderness that needed no further words to explain itself. "I told you once I would not spend my life whispering to you in shadow," he said, loudly enough for the nearest guests to hear clearly. "I meant every word. Whatever whispers follow us from this room tonight, they will find nothing hidden left to discover. You are my wife, Eleanor, in full view of everyone who matters, and I would not trade that truth for every fortune this house has ever held." The orchestra, sensing perhaps that the drama had reached some natural resolution, began to play again, tentative at first before gathering confidence, and slowly the frozen tableau of shocked guests began to shift back into motion, conversation resuming in hushed, excited tones that would no doubt carry this story through every drawing room in the county for months to come. Eleanor barely noticed any of it at first. She stood in the center of the ballroom, held securely in her husband's arms, and for the first time since the corridor where this final chapter of their story had truly begun, she felt no fear at all, only the solid, unshakable certainty that whatever scandal followed them from this night, they would face it together, in the open, exactly as they were always meant to. As the music continued and the guests slowly returned to something resembling normal conversation, though every word exchanged now carried an undercurrent of fascinated gossip, an older woman approached Eleanor with sharp, curious eyes and a fan she used more for punctuation than for cooling herself. "I do not believe we have been introduced properly," the woman said, her tone carrying the particular blend of curiosity and judgment common to those who had spent decades cataloging the scandals of lesser and greater families alike. "Lady Ferris, of Marlow Park. I confess I have never witnessed an evening quite like this one in all my years attending balls in this county." "Eleanor Ashbourne," Eleanor said, offering the name with a steadiness that surprised her, feeling the shape of it settle into place as though it had always belonged to her. "I apologize if the evening's revelations disturbed your enjoyment of the ball." Lady Ferris studied her for a long moment, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Eleanor's composure, her gown, the way she stood beside the Duke without a trace of the shame society might expect from a woman revealed so publicly as a secret wife. "Disturbed," Lady Ferris repeated, a small, unexpected smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "My dear girl, I have not been so thoroughly entertained at a ball since my own wedding 40 years ago, and that affair involved considerably less honesty than what I witnessed here tonight. Most young couples in your position would have spent years hiding behind polite fictions rather than face a room full of gossips directly. I find myself rather admiring the courage it took to do otherwise." Eleanor felt a small, genuine smile break through her lingering nerves. "Thank you, Lady Ferris," she said. "Though I confess I did not feel especially courageous in the moment, only tired of hiding." "Sometimes those are one and the same thing," Lady Ferris replied with a knowing look before moving off into the crowd, no doubt to share her impressions with whichever cluster of guests proved most eager to hear them first. Across the room, Eleanor watched Lord Colcott finally lead his daughter and Nathaniel toward a quieter alcove, the three of them deep in conversation that, from the softening of the older man's rigid posture, seemed to be moving toward something other than outright refusal. Vivian caught Eleanor's eye across the distance and offered a small, hopeful smile before returning her attention to the negotiation that would determine her own future happiness. The Dowager Duchess appeared at Eleanor's side sometime later, watching the same scene with an expression Eleanor could not entirely read. "He will come around," the Dowager said quietly, nodding toward Lord Colcott. "Men like him value appearances above almost everything else, but appearances can be managed. A respectable position, a properly conducted courtship conducted now in the open rather than in secret, perhaps even a modest settlement to smooth over his wounded pride. He will find a way to accept it that allows him to save face before his peers, mark my words. You sound as though you understand him well, Eleanor observed. I have spent 40 years understanding men exactly like him, the dowager replied dryly. It is unfortunately one of the few skills this life has taught me thoroughly. She paused, then added, more quietly, I owe you an apology as well, though I confess such words do not come easily to me after so many years of believing myself entitled to command rather than to reconsider. You owe me nothing, Your Grace, Eleanor said gently. I owe you the acknowledgement that I misjudged you, the dowager said firmly, as though determined to finish the thought now that she had begun it. I believed you a scheming opportunist when first I learned of the marriage, a woman who had trapped my son through deception for the sake of a title. I see now that I was wrong, and a woman of my age and position should have the grace to admit as much when the evidence stands so plainly before her. Eleanor reached out and, in a gesture that surprised them both, took the dowager's hand briefly in her own. Then let us begin again, she said simply, from this evening forward. The dowager's eyes glistened for just a moment before her usual composure reasserted itself, though something in her expression had softened permanently, Eleanor suspected, in a way that would outlast even this remarkable night. As the ball wound toward its natural conclusion, guests departing in carriages that would carry tonight's scandal to every corner of the county by morning, Gideon found Eleanor once more near the tall windows overlooking the darkened gardens, the same gardens where he had once promised her that a fortnight would end their hiding forever. You kept your promise, Eleanor said softly, watching the last of the candles gutter low around the emptying ballroom. I did, Gideon agreed, drawing her close against him, though I confess the fortnight nearly broke me before it ended in anything resembling triumph. He pressed a kiss to her hair, breathing in the quiet relief of a battle finally, truly won. Whatever comes next, Eleanor, whatever gossip or difficulty follows us from this night, I find I no longer fear it, not with you standing beside me in the light instead of hidden away in shadow. Eleanor barely noticed the departing guests any longer. She stood in the center of the emptying ballroom, held securely in her husband's arms, and for the first time since the corridor where this final chapter of their story had truly begun, she felt no fear at all, only the solid, unshakable certainty that whatever scandal followed them from this night, they would face it together, in the open, exactly as they were always meant to. Smoke curled from the chimney of the estate office at dawn, and inside, Gideon sat surrounded by ledgers stacked higher than Eleanor had ever seen them, his sleeves rolled and his hair disheveled from a night spent working rather than sleeping. You have not rested at all, Eleanor said from the doorway, carrying a tray of tea and bread she had prepared herself rather than summon a servant at such an early hour. There is too much still to settle, Gideon said, though he accepted the tea gratefully, rubbing at his tired eyes. The scandal from the ball has quieted somewhat these past 3 weeks, but Pemberton writes that 2 more creditors wish to renegotiate their terms, now that word has spread of the estate's improved position. I would rather face them prepared than caught unprepared a second time in my life. Eleanor set the tray down and moved to stand behind his chair, resting her hands on his shoulders and feeling the tension knotted there beneath his shirt. Let me help, she said. I may not understand ledgers as well as you do, but I have kept careful accounts of household expenses since I was young enough to hold a pencil, and 4 eyes catch more errors than 2. Gideon glanced up at her with a tired but genuine smile, an expression that had become far more common in the weeks since the ball than the guarded caution that once seemed to live permanently behind his eyes. I do not deserve you, he said. Any of this would be a great deal harder to bear alone. You are not alone, Eleanor reminded him, pulling a chair beside his own and reaching for the nearest ledger. You have not been alone since the day you knelt in that field of wildflowers with nothing but a ribbon in your hand, however much this house tried to convince you otherwise these past months. They worked together through the morning, and Eleanor found, to her quiet satisfaction, that her practical mind for numbers proved genuinely useful, catching a small discrepancy in one column that had troubled Gideon for days without his understanding why the totals never quite balanced. By midday, they had made real progress, and Gideon leaned back in his chair with something like relief settling into his shoulders for the first time in weeks. A letter arrived that afternoon bearing Vivian's now familiar handwriting, and Eleanor opened it eagerly, reading the contents aloud to Gideon as her own smile grew wider with each line. She writes that her father has finally consented to the match with Nathaniel, Eleanor said, her voice bright with genuine happiness for her friend. He insisted on a full year of courtship before any formal engagement, and Nathaniel must demonstrate continued success in his position, but Vivian says he has already begun softening considerably, even inviting Nathaniel to dine with the family twice these past weeks. That is welcome news indeed, Gideon said. I confess I worried for her more than I let myself admit, watching her stand before that entire ballroom and speak such difficult truths so bravely. She writes something else as well, Eleanor continued, her eyes scanning further down the page, her expression shifting toward something more thoughtful. She says the county gossip has largely turned in our favor, that most families now speak of our marriage as a great romance rather than a scandal, and that several mothers with unmarried daughters have apparently begun pressuring their husbands to arrange similarly honest courtships rather than the cold contracts so common among the nobility. Gideon laughed, a real, unguarded sound that Eleanor had come to treasure more than almost anything else in their life together. We may have started something of a small revolution then, he said, without ever intending to. Perhaps some revolutions begin exactly that way, Eleanor replied, not through grand design, but through two people simply refusing to accept less than honesty and discovering that others were quietly hungry for the same courage. That evening, the Dowager Duchess joined them for dinner, a practice that had become steadily more comfortable over the past 3 weeks, as the sharp edges of her initial resistance continued to soften into something Eleanor might almost call warmth, though the older woman would never admit to such a sentiment directly. I received word today from an old friend in London, the Dowager said as the final course was cleared away. She writes that our family's standing has actually improved somewhat since the scandal, rather than diminished as I once feared it might. It seems honesty, however unconventional its arrival, carries its own peculiar currency among those tired of pretense. Gideon reached across the table and took Eleanor's hand openly, a gesture that would have been unthinkable in this formal dining room only 2 months before. Then perhaps honesty was always the wiser investment, he said, glancing toward his mother with something like gentle challenge in his expression. The Dowager's mouth twitched with what might have been the beginning of a smile before she composed herself once more. Do not grow too pleased with yourself, she said, though her tone carried none of its old severity. There remains a great deal of work ahead before this estate stands on truly secure footing. Romance alone does not pay creditors, however charming the county may currently find our family's story. No, Eleanor agreed, but it makes the work of paying them considerably easier to bear, does it not? The Dowager considered this for a moment, then inclined her head slightly, a small concession that Eleanor had learned to recognize as high praise from a woman who rarely offered it freely. In the weeks that followed, life at Ashbourne settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Gideon had dared to imagine possible during the anxious fortnight before the ball. Pemberton's careful management of the estate's finances continued to bear fruit, the renegotiated terms with creditors holding firm, the northern fields under their new owner beginning to yield the first signs of renewed prosperity that would benefit the whole county, not merely the estate that had sold them. Eleanor no longer worked among the seamstresses, though she visited the sewing room often, finding in its familiar rhythms a comfort she was not yet ready to abandon entirely, and Charlotte, the bright-eyed young seamstress who had once chattered about the coming engagement without knowing the truth hidden beside her, had become something of a friend, delighted rather than resentful to learn that the quiet woman who once shared her table was in fact the new Duchess of the house. You might have told me sooner, Charlotte teased one afternoon, as Eleanor sat with her in the sewing room simply to enjoy the familiar company. I spent weeks complaining to you about the unfairness of arranged marriages, never once realizing I was complaining to a woman who understood the matter rather better than I did myself. I could hardly have told you the truth without endangering everything we were trying to protect, Eleanor said, laughing softly at the memory. But I promise you now, freely, that your complaints were entirely justified, and I hope you find a marriage built on something sturdier than arrangement alone, whenever your own time comes. One crisp morning in early October, an invitation arrived bearing Vivian's now elegant, confident handwriting, requesting Eleanor and Gideon's presence at a small gathering to celebrate her formal engagement to Nathaniel. The full year of courtship her father had originally demanded shortened considerably once he witnessed the steady rise of Nathaniel's fortunes and the evident sincerity of his devotion to her happiness. The gathering took place in the modest but handsome townhouse Nathaniel had recently secured in the city, and Eleanor arrived to find Vivian glowing with a happiness entirely different from the composed sadness she had carried on the day their carriage wheel first broke upon the eastern road. You look radiant, Eleanor told her, embracing her warmly as old friends might, though their friendship had been forged in only a handful of frightened, urgent weeks. I feel radiant, Vivian admitted, laughing freely in a way Eleanor suspected she had rarely allowed herself before this past autumn. My father even smiled at the engagement dinner, Eleanor, an actual smile. Not merely the polite curve of lips he reserves for company he tolerates rather than enjoys. I believe he has genuinely come to respect Nathaniel, though he would never admit as much so plainly. Nathaniel joined them shortly after, greeting Gideon with the easy warmth of two men who had, despite their vastly different stations, discovered genuine mutual respect through the shared experience of fighting for the women they loved against considerable odds. "I owe you both a debt I do not know how to properly repay," Nathaniel said quietly to Eleanor and Gideon as the small gathering settled into comfortable conversation around them. "Had you not shown such courage that night at the ball, I do not know that I would have found the nerve to speak before Lord Colcott and the entire assembled county myself." "You owed us nothing," Gideon said firmly. "You showed remarkable courage of your own, arriving uninvited to defend the woman you loved before a room full of strangers ready to judge you unkindly. That courage was entirely your own to claim." As the afternoon light softened toward evening, Eleanor found herself standing beside Vivian near a window overlooking the quiet street below, watching Gideon and Nathaniel deep in conversation about shipping investments that might benefit the newly stabilized Ashbourne estate. "Do you ever think of that broken carriage wheel?" Vivian asked suddenly, a thoughtful smile playing at her lips. "I have wondered since, whether it truly was some manner of omen, exactly as I said that first frightened day, though not the omen of doom I believed it to be at the time. Perhaps it was simply the first crack in a wall neither of us realized needed breaking," Eleanor said. "Sometimes the paths that seem most disastrous at their beginning prove, in time, to have carried us exactly where we needed to go all along." Vivian squeezed her hand affectionately. "Whatever it was," she said, "I am endlessly grateful it broke precisely when and where it did, and that it delivered me into the path of a seamstress with more wisdom and courage than half the nobility of this county combined." They returned to Ashbourne that evening in comfortable, companionable silence, the carriage rocking gently along familiar roads that no longer held any trace of the dread Eleanor had once carried through every mile of them. As autumn deepened into the first cold mornings of the changing season, Gideon surprised Eleanor with an invitation to walk with him beyond the formal gardens, into the wilder countryside that bordered the estate, a place she had not yet properly explored in all her months at Ashbourne. He led her along a familiar-looking path, and as they crested a small rise, Eleanor stopped short, her breath catching at the sight spread before her. A field stretched out below them, not identical to the one where they had first exchanged their vows so many months ago, but similar enough in its wild, unmanicured beauty that her heart ached with sweet recognition. "I had this field cleared and planted these past weeks," Gideon admitted, watching her reaction carefully. "I know it cannot replace the place where we truly began, but I wanted somewhere here, on this land that is now fully ours to protect, that might remind us both of where our story started, whenever the pressures of the house grow heavy enough to make us forget." Eleanor walked forward into the field, wildflowers brushing against her skirts exactly as they had that first golden afternoon, and when she turned back to face him, tears stood bright in her eyes, though her smile had never been wider. "You did not need to give me a field," she said softly. "You already gave me everything that mattered, the day you chose honesty over hiding, in front of that entire ballroom." Gideon crossed the distance between them and knelt, just as he had done once before in a different field, in a different life, though this time he withdrew from his coat not a length of ribbon but a ring, simple and elegant, catching the last golden light of the afternoon. "I know we are already married," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know the vows we spoke in that broken chapel bound us as truly as any grand ceremony could. But I wanted to ask you properly, here, with nothing left hidden between us, and nothing left to fear from the world beyond this field. Eleanor, will you continue choosing me, exactly as I intend to spend every remaining day of my life choosing you?" Eleanor sank down before him in the wildflowers, careless of her gown, and took his face in both her hands. "I chose you the first time you told me your true name and feared I might reject you for it," she said. "I chose you again in that dark corridor, and again through every frightened night of that fortnight. And I will keep choosing you every single day for as long as we both shall live. Yes, Gideon. Always yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, replacing at last the memory of ribbon with something as permanent and enduring as the love it now represented. And when he kissed her there among the wildflowers, Eleanor felt the last lingering shadow of fear finally dissolve completely, leaving behind only the bright, solid certainty of a life built openly, honestly, and entirely upon their own terms. When they returned to the house that evening, the ring catching candlelight upon Eleanor's hand, Mrs. Whitfield was the first to notice, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she greeted them at the door with a tray of warm cider, meant to ward off the evening chill. "I did say secrets have a way of finding daylight," the housekeeper said, a knowing smile spreading across her weathered face as she caught sight of the ring. "Though I confess I never imagined this particular secret would end quite so happily." nor that I would live to see the day a duke proposed twice to the same woman, before all was said and done. Word spread through the household before supper had even finished being served, and by the time Eleanor made her way to the sewing room the following morning, Charlotte and the other seamstresses had already prepared a small, informal celebration, insisting on seeing the ring for themselves and offering their genuine, warm congratulations to the woman who had once sat quietly among them, sharing their table without ever revealing the truth of who she really was. "You will not forget us now that you are properly settled as Duchess, will you?" Charlotte asked, only half teasing, as she admired the ring with unabashed delight. "Never," Eleanor promised, meaning it completely. "This room taught me more about patience and honest work than any grand hall in this house ever could. I do not intend to forget where I found my footing, whatever title I now carry alongside it." They walked back to the house together as the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, hand in hand, no longer a duke and his hidden secret but simply a husband and wife, known fully and completely by everyone who mattered, their story no longer whispered in dark corridors but spoken proudly wherever it was told. The duke had once whispered in the dark that she belonged to someone else, mistaking her for a woman she was never meant to be. He had been wrong that night, though neither of them yet understood how completely. Eleanor had never belonged to anyone else at all. She had always, from the very beginning, belonged entirely to him, exactly as he belonged entirely to her, and no fortune, no scandal, and no fear had ever been strong enough to change that simple, unshakable truth. Snow fell softly over Ashbourne the following winter, and inside the great house, laughter echoed through halls that had once known only the cold formality of duty and debt. Eleanor stood in the nursery that had been prepared months in advance, her hand resting gently against the curve of her stomach, watching Gideon argue good-naturedly with a carpenter over the placement of a small wooden cradle he had insisted on carving himself, refusing every offer to purchase one ready-made from the finest craftsman in London. "It must be carved by my own hands," he had told her weeks before, when she teased him gently about the long hours he spent in the workshop rather than his study. "Everything else in this child's life may come easily, given all we have built together, but I want at least this one thing to carry the mark of my own effort, exactly as our marriage did from its very first day." The Dowager Duchess had taken to the coming arrival with a warmth that still occasionally surprised Eleanor, insisting on selecting fine linens and consulting physicians from London, despite Eleanor's protests that the local midwife, a capable woman named Agnes who had delivered half the children in the county, was entirely sufficient for her needs. "Indulge an old woman her worries," the Dowager had said, waving away every objection with practiced authority that had softened, over the past year, into something closer to genuine affection than command. "I have waited a very long time for this house to hold the sound of a child's laughter again, and I do not intend to leave anything to chance now that the moment finally approaches." Vivian and Nathaniel had married the previous spring, in a ceremony considerably grander than the small chapel where Eleanor and Gideon had first exchanged their own vows, though Vivian had confided privately that she would have gladly traded every elegant detail for the simple honesty of a smaller affair, had her father not insisted on a proper celebration to formally announce his acceptance of the match before the entire county. Nathaniel's continued success in his firm had silenced whatever lingering doubts Lord Calcott once harbored, and the couple now split their time between the city and a modest country house not far from Ashbourne, close enough that Vivian and Eleanor visited each other, with a regularity that had deepened their friendship into something neither woman had expected to find, so far from where they began. The estate itself had continued its slow, steady recovery, the northern fields now fully restored to productivity under their new owner's careful management, the renegotiated debts nearly settled in full through a combination of Pemberton's continued diligence and Gideon's own hands-on involvement in matters he had once left entirely to others. Tenants who had once whispered fearfully of the estate's uncertain future now spoke instead of the young Duke and Duchess who walked their own fields, who knew their names and the names of their children, who had somehow transformed a house built on cold obligation into something that felt, for the first time in a generation, genuinely alive. Eleanor still visited the sewing room regularly, though her role there had shifted from seamstress to something closer to patron, funding proper wages and better conditions for the women who worked there, remembering vividly what it meant to labor long hours for little recognition, while carrying secrets too heavy to share with anyone around her. Charlotte had been promoted to oversee the room entirely, a position she filled with evident pride, and the two women remained close friends despite the difference in their stations, meeting often for tea and conversation that never once felt burdened by the formality such friendships might have carried in a different household. As winter deepened and the child's arrival drew nearer, Eleanor found herself thinking often of that first frightened night in the dark corridor, of the words that had once shattered her world before rebuilding it into something far sturdier than she could have imagined possible. She thought of the dowager's cold fury transformed slowly into genuine warmth, of Vivian's frightened confession transformed into joyful defiance, of Nathaniel's nervous courage before an entire ballroom of strangers, of every small, frightened step that had somehow, against every obstacle arranged to stop them, carried them all to exactly where they needed to be. The child arrived on a bright, cold morning in late January, a daughter with her father's dark eyes and, according to Mrs. Whitfield, who had assisted at more births than she cared to count over her many years of service, her mother's unmistakable stubborn determination, already evident in the strength of her first cries. They named her Grace, a name chosen not for any grand family tradition but simply because it felt, to both of them, like the truest word for everything that had carried them through the darkest days of their story into the light they now stood within together. Gideon held his daughter for the first time with hands that trembled more than they had on any night of confronting his mother, or facing a ballroom full of scandalized guests, and when he looked up at Eleanor, exhausted but radiant in the soft morning light, his eyes were bright with tears he made no effort to hide. "She belongs to us," he said softly, echoing without quite realizing it the words that had once torn Eleanor's world apart in a dark corridor, now transformed into something that carried only tenderness and certainty, entirely to us, and to no one else's plans or arrangements ever again. Eleanor reached for his hand, and for a long, quiet moment, the three of them remained simply together, a small family built not from the cold calculations of duty and debt that had once threatened to define this house, but from honesty chosen freely, again and again, through every difficult test that had tried to separate them. Word of the birth spread quickly through the county, carried by servants and neighbors, and the same eager gossips who had once whispered scandal about a duke's secret marriage, now whispering instead of the remarkable love story that had somehow produced this newest chapter of joy. Letters of congratulations arrived from every corner of society, including a particularly warm one from Lady Ferris, who wrote that she looked forward to watching young Grace grow into a woman carrying, she had no doubt, the same fearless honesty that had so thoroughly entertained her at that memorable ball nearly 2 years before. Even Lord Calcott, whose approval had once seemed the most distant and improbable outcome of the entire affair, sent a handsome silver rattle along with a brief but genuinely warm note expressing his hope that young Grace would grow up surrounded by exactly the kind of honest happiness her parents had fought so hard to secure for themselves. Eleanor read the note twice, quietly moved by how far the old man's rigid pride had traveled since that furious night in the ballroom, when he had demanded his daughter retract her declaration of love before the assembled county. Vivian arrived within days of receiving the news, cradling Grace with the practiced ease of a woman clearly already anticipating children of her own, her eyes bright with happiness for her dear friend. "She is perfect," Vivian declared, settling into a chair beside Eleanor's bed with the newborn nestled securely against her. "I confess I am almost jealous, though Nathaniel assures me our own turn will come soon enough, once we have settled properly into married life." "You will make a wonderful mother," Eleanor said warmly, watching her friend's evident tenderness with the child. "Whenever that day arrives, your child will be fortunate indeed to have parents who chose each other so completely, against every obstacle arranged to keep you apart." Mrs. Whitfield, too, made a point of visiting the nursery each morning before her other duties began, claiming she needed only to check upon the linens or the temperature of the room. Though everyone in the household understood well enough that the aging housekeeper simply could not resist the chance to hold the newest member of a family she had watched grow from a lonely, guarded young duke and a frightened, hidden seamstress into something far warmer than either of them could have imagined during those first anxious days of secrecy. She often reminded Eleanor, with a knowing smile, that she had predicted this happiness from the very beginning, though Eleanor suspected the housekeeper's confidence in that long-ago prediction had grown considerably more certain with the comfortable benefit of hindsight. As the seasons continued their steady turn, and Grace grew from a fragile newborn into a curious, laughing toddler who delighted in chasing the household cats through the very gardens where her parents had once whispered anxious plans in the shadows, Eleanor often found herself returning to the wildflower field Gideon had planted for her, now grown wild and beautiful across 3 full seasons, exactly as he had promised it would. She sat there one warm afternoon in early summer, watching Grace toddle unsteadily through the tall grass while Gideon knelt nearby, patient and laughing as he guided their daughter's small hands toward a particularly bright cluster of blooms, and Eleanor allowed herself, finally, completely, to simply exist within the happiness she had once feared might never be permitted to her. The Duke had once whispered in a dark corridor that she belonged to someone else, mistaking her identity in a moment of confusion that had nearly unraveled everything before their story had truly begun. He had been wrong that night, profoundly and completely wrong, though it had taken every ounce of courage they both possessed, and the unexpected kindness of allies neither had anticipated, to prove it beyond any doubt the world might later raise against them. Eleanor had never belonged to anyone else at all. She had always belonged exactly here, in this field, in this house, in this life built openly and honestly upon a foundation no scandal, no arranged marriage, and no fear had ever been strong enough to break. And watching her husband and daughter laughing together among the wildflowers, their voices carrying bright and unguarded across the warm summer air, Eleanor understood, with a certainty that had taken every difficult step of their journey to fully earn, that some stories did not end when the scandal quieted or the debts were finally settled. Some stories simply continued, day after ordinary, extraordinary day, exactly as theirs now would, for as long as they both had breath to keep choosing each other, freely and completely, exactly as they always had from the very beginning.